What happens when two of the GOATs in chess, the two best players of all time, face each other? And no, I'm not talking about Hikaru or Anatoly Karpov. I'm talking about Magnus Carlsen and Garry Kasparov. 12 years ago, both of them played in a tournament, and in the round that was coming up next, they were playing each other. A 13-year-old Magnus Carlsen facing the GOAT, Garry Kasparov. Some would say that Magnus is the GOAT, some would say that Kasparov is. But today, we're gonna find out who the actual GOAT is. And we will look at the game, and you will rate who was better. Let's get to it. Magnus begins with the game with the move d4, and then Kasparov responds with d5, the symmetrical. Then Magnus Carlsen plays c4, the Queen's Gambit, and Kasparov responds with the move c6, also known as the Slav defense. Magnus chooses to go with the modern line with knight f3, and Kasparov responds with knight f6. Then Magnus plays knight c2, and Kasparov pushes his e-pawn to the e6 square, completing the pyramid of pawns. Magnus then develops the bishop on g5, pinning Kasparov's knight to his queen, and Kasparov responds with knight d7. Magnus then pushes his pawn on e3, wanting to develop the bishop and castle and have a completely winning position. Not completely winning, but to be in a very good position against someone like Kasparov. Kasparov responds with queen a5, looking to put pressure on this knight and developing this bishop. And Magnus responds with knight d2. Kasparov then develops the bishop on b4, and Magnus places his queen on the c2 square. And then Kasparov chooses to castle, and Magnus develops the bishop on e2, wanting to do the same. Kasparov pushes the pawn on e6 to e5, but Magnus is not bothered and he just castles. And Kasparov chooses to capture the pawn on d4, but Magnus, before he captures, he puts his knight on b3, attacking his queen and forcing Kasparov to move his queen and Magnus to win the pawn. Kasparov moves his queen on b6, and Magnus captures the pawn with his e-pawn, and now has two pawns in the center. Kasparov captures the pawn on c4, and Magnus recaptures it with the bishop. Kasparov pushes his pawn to the a5 square, and Magnus responds with a4. Kasparov drops back his queen to the c7 square, and Magnus develops the rook. He plays rook a e1. Kasparov decides to kick Magnus's bishop on g5 and force him to go back on h4. Now Kasparov puts his bishop, his dark-squared bishop, on the d6 square, looking to take Magnus's pawn with check and weakening his king. So Magnus responds with pawn h3. And yet, yes, this move is still possible, but it will do nothing, as you will not be capturing a pawn, you will just be giving a useless check. So Kasparov moves his knight to b6, and Magnus Carlsen captures the knight on f6 with his bishop. And Kasparov does not capture the bishop right now, but instead he captures this one on the c4 square. And now Magnus moves his knight, this knight, to the e4 square. So Kasparov gives this check, so Magnus is forced to move his king to h1. And Kasparov drops back with his knight on the d6 square. Magnus captures the bishop with his king, and now Kasparov can capture this knight with the discovered attack, or check, if you may. And that's exactly what he does. He captures the knight on e4, and now Magnus is under check, so he moves. So he doesn't move, he blocks with the bishop. That was previously on f6, and now is threatening to capture the knight. So Kasparov moves it out of the way and puts it on d6, and Magnus plays queen c5. Kasparov develops the rook on d8, and Magnus pushes his d-pawn on d5 square. Kasparov moves his queen on d7, looking to create some danger here if Magnus were to ever push this pawn on g3. So Magnus plays knight d4, knight d4, involving the knight and getting it back into the game. Kasparov moves his knight on the f5 square, and Magnus captures a pawn on c6. Kasparov recaptures, and now Magnus captures a pawn with his knight, and he cannot take because of the queen. So Kasparov is forced to move his rook on e8. Now Magnus develops the rook on d1 and attacks the queen on d7. So Kasparov moves it to e6. Magnus develops the other rook on e1 and potentially setting up some devious attacks against this queen. And Kasparov chooses to ignore that by attacking this knight on c6. And Magnus either has to move it or defend, because two pieces are attacking and it is only defended once. So Magnus drops back to d4. Pieces get traded, both knights, of course, and Kasparov moves his queen to g6, setting up a checkmate. But Magnus doesn't miss that and plays queen g4. Kasparov captures the queen, and Magnus recaptures, of course. And now Kasparov places his bishop on c6. Magnus defends it, and Kasparov chooses to kick Magnus's bishop, that is on e5. Magnus drops back. Rooks get traded, and now Kasparov is attacking Magnus's weak pawn on b3. Magnus defends it with rook b1. And Kasparov decides to bring the king into this endgame because, as you all know, kings are very important in the endgame in chess. So Magnus does exactly the same. Queen g3, king g3, I'm sorry. Kasparov develops his rook on b8 and is threatening to capture this pawn, I'm sorry. So Magnus pushes it. The pawns get traded, and Kasparov moves his bishop to c4. Magnus pushes his a4 pawn to the a5 square, and Kasparov blocks it with his bishop. Magnus pushes the f2 pawn to the f3 square, and Kasparov brings his king and puts it on the g6 square. Magnus brings his king to f4, cutting off the king completely, and Kasparov tries to make some space for his king by wanting to trade the pawns, these two. So Magnus, of course, captures, and Garry Kasparov recaptures, and now Magnus gives a check with his rook on h1. Kasparov moves his king back on a g6 square, and now Magnus places his bishop on c5. Kasparov goes down with his rook, wanting to take this pawn that is weak, so Magnus defends it with his king on g3. Kasparov moves to the left on the a2 square, is now threatening to capture this pawn, so Magnus defends it by playing bishop b6, and now these two pieces are defending each other, and you cannot take either of them. So Kasparov moves his king on the f7 square, and Magnus redevelops the rook on the c1 square. Kasparov pushes his pawn to the g5 square, and Magnus gives a check with his rook, and Kasparov moves to g6. Carlsen moves back his rook to the c6 square, threatening to have a discovered attack on this bishop. So Kasparov moves it out of the way and puts it on e2. Magnus Magnus puts his bishop as well on e3. He goes back out of this way, and this is where both players shake hands and agree to a draw. As you can see from the evaluation, it's a dead draw even before this move. Even though you could argue that Magnus had a small advantage, it was definitely not that big of an advantage to have a win, because even though Magnus has a passed pawn, it would likely get captured, as Kasparov would put pressure on this side, on the king side, while while you try to push this pawn, you cannot focus, of course, on the both sides, so you can deal with this and this. So that's why the players agreed on a draw, and yeah, that's it.